This kill story is about a late season buck I took in Ohio in 2016. It was a big 10-pointer taken several days after the gun season in Ohio ended. In 2015 and in 2016 on the Saddle Hunter Forum, which is a hunting talk forum dedicated to saddle hunters, I was exchanging hunting information and stories with Mike, who was a bow hunter from Ohio. In early 2016, he called and offered an open invite to bow hunt whenever I had time to come down and hunt near his home in Ohio. With the current Ohio State University of Michigan football rivalry that was going on at the time, and me being from Michigan, I was a bit tentative about crossing the state line and leaving my Michigan plated soccer mom minivan parked unattended. On my first trip to Kansas in 2004, some pissed off residents that didn't like out-of-state hunters coming down and potentially taking some of their mature bucks, I had all 4 of my tires on my minivan flattened, and my hunting buddy that was with me with a big 4-wheel drive pickup truck, his tires were all flattened as well. We were parked overnight in a motel parking lot. And that was on Saturday night that they got flattened, so the next morning was Sunday. And needless to say, it was very tough to get somebody to come out and repair the tires on a Sunday, but we did end up getting it done. To be honest, though, I really wasn't that concerned about it happening in Ohio, as while we have a bittersweet rivalry. Ohio State's been kicking our asses for several years, so I don't think they're that mad at us, as mad as we are at them. Mike didn't own or lease any property, but his good friend was a realtor, and he had a 243-acre parcel listed and gave Mike free reins on it until it was sold. It's difficult on short-term hunts to learn the subtle deer movement nuances on a piece of property, such as where do the deer bed, where might a mature buck feed during daylight hours, where might a mature buck feel comfortable transitioning through during daylight hours, how much hunting pressure does the surrounding properties receive, especially during gun season, because I was going to be down there after gun season, and how did that pressure affect daytime deer movements. This property had been vacant for a couple of years and was at least an hour away from where Mike had lived. I've hunted long enough to know that when properties are unattended and have easy road access into the timber along its borders, that there's likely going to be issues with trespassers. That would certainly be the case in Michigan. Any place I've ever hunted, if I was knock-on-doors property and the timber butted up to a dirt road, I always had issues with trespassers getting dropped off on the road. The property was near Kimbolton, and the only time I could foresee a lag in my work schedule was in the week of December between Ohio's main, I think it's a 7 to 10 day gun season, and then the following weekend they have a 2-day gun season. So the only time I could see going would be between that week between the main gun season, and I would also still be there during the 2-day weekend gun season, their last gun season. Mike and the realtor had both hunted the property during the early bow season and the first gun season. They had several motion cameras out and sent me several pictures of a drop-time buck and also of a clean 10-point, along with a few Google Earth photos of the entire property to try and entice me to come down. The realtor didn't care, but Mike wanted me to come down. He wanted to meet me. Mike had taken a couple shots at a big 10-point during the gun season, but he missed on both occasions. Mike told me that the bordering properties also got bow and gun hunted and that he had no clue of what bucks in the area might have been taken. So that big 8 that had a drop time making it a 9 might have been gone, or the big 10 might have been gone. He did not know. Mike's enticement worked, and on December 9th I drove down and checked into a flea bag motel in Cambridge, Ohio with a kitchenette. And Cambridge was, I think it was about 40 minutes from where I was hunting in Kimbolton. Mike invited me to stay at his place, but it was more than an hour away. Mike had to work, so I would be on my own, which I'm accustomed to, especially in the late season. Nobody typically wants to go during the late season. I slept in the first morning and arrived at the property at around 9:30 a.m. And I did that because I didn't want to spook deer, even with my scouting presence, when they might still be out moving around on the property. And while driving around the area before I entered into it, I was absolutely blown away at how beautiful this property was. and the surrounding area itself. The property had 3 ponds, 2 tillable crop fields that hadn't been planted in a couple of years, had several small stands of timber with dense briars and as understory. And to top it all off, it had a large river along its eastern border with brush, briars, and some mature trees running along both banks. While I researched and printed some aerial photos of the property before I left home, I hadn't looked at any topo maps of it. I just assumed it would be relatively flat, and man was I wrong. The property was nicely tucked in a valley surrounded by very steep rolling hills littered with patches of timber, areas of big, tall, golden-colored weed fields on some of the side hills, and there were mature white pines scattered along the riverbank and along the south end of the larger of the 2 old crop fields. As I always do during season when scouting or preparing locations, I was wearing a complete scentlock suit comprised of a jacket, pants, gloves, a scentlock ball cap, a scentlock loaded pack with my prep gear in it, and clean rubber boots. I always keep all of my old suits once I think they're beyond the use for hunting, and I use those for scouting. With all the foliage down and with no snow, as cautiously as I possibly could, I scouted the property, making every attempt not to molest any possible areas that deer may be bedded in. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to adequately scout a new property for a short-term hunt without bumping deer. Make that time frame in mid-December, 2 days after the main gun season, with frozen ground and crunchy leaves, and without snow to show current movements, and it's actually impossible. There's no way of doing that without bumping deer. There was a narrow stand of timber at the north end of the property that ran up a steep hillside, and Mike felt certain that the drop time buck had been bedding in that dense briars within it earlier in the season. The motion pictures they had were around that area of timber. Upon inspection, it was still very well suited for daytime mature buck movements because it offered dense transition security cover from the valley over the top of the hill. However, it couldn't be accessed for a hunt without either spooking deer in the valley with a prior to daybreak morning entry, or without spooking deer bedded in it with an evening entry. With the foliage down and the noise associated with walking on dry leaves, that stand of timber had significant late-season hunting downfalls for hunting within it. But stubbornly, I had to check it out and spooked 4 deer while doing so. About halfway up the hill, there was a small flat bench that was relatively open, and it had several inactive scrapes within it, and it was surrounded by at least 20 rubs, and it would have been an awesome pre-rut phase location. It was perfectly suited for a rut phase location coming down that hill. All the transition security cover fed right into that little opening. That's why the scrapes were there, because there was a lot of doe traffic there during the regular season. Because it was the first really good location and it had some fresh tracks going through it, I set up a black cherry tree overlooking the scrape area. The farthest scrape from the black cherry was probably about 15 yards. It was a relatively small flat. From a distance, on 2 separate occasions, Mike had glassed that big 10-point coming out of the mature white pines along the south end of the larger of the 2 weed fields. The pines were along the entire south side of that field and turned and ran 100 yards or so to the north along the east side of the field. The pines along the east side were also the buffer between the east side of the field and the river, and that buffer was probably about 30 yards wide. While I badly wanted to hunt the hillside scrape area, due to its significant entry and exit downfalls for that time of year, I knew better and figured my best percentage odds of a daytime visit by a mature buck was someplace along those pines. A few advantages the pines offered were, they were within 80 yards of my walk-in entry lane. Also, due to the landscape, they offered both an entry and exit strategy that would likely not spook deer. The pines offered significant front and back cover concealment cover while I would be sitting in the tree hunting. They had significant, substantial security cover to transition through, and they would buffer the cold winds and snow that were in the forecast. The mature white pines along the south end of that field ran about 250 yards in distance, but they were only 5 rows deep. And beyond those 5 rows to the south, the pines dropped off into a valley of brush and dense briars where deer would bed. As with most mature white pines, the bottom 8 to 10 feet of branches were dead, and due to the lack of foliage on the briars and brush in the valley to the south, I could not walk along the edge of those pines during an evening entry without deer bedded in the brush below seeing me and spooking. Mike had had similar issues when he had entered there during the regular season, when he was walking along the tree line. While walking the edge of the pines while scouting, I spooked at least 3 deer that were bedded in the valley below, and I'm sure there were others I didn't see. I had no option but to search for a tree along the edge and then make the noise and commotion of setting it up. After all, this was the scouting and prep day, and I had no option but to set something up. Unexpectedly for that time of year, there were several active scrapes under some of the big pines along the field edge. There was one spot where the field took a 90-degree turn to the south, and it went south for about 30 yards, the tree line, and then it turned 90 degrees again and went due east over towards the river. That first turn created a point in the field, and there was a scrape under the corner pine, and that is the pine I set up in. I had to cut an area out of the pine for my saddle setup and use Cranford screw and folding steps for climbing, and Cranford Deluxe steps for my ring of steps that I would be hunting from, because I never use a platform, as I feel that is a negative. After preparing the location for my 2-panel ESS, I had shot options anywhere along the field, but no shot opportunities back into the pines. There would have been just too much of the trees I would have had to rape to make any shots back into the pines, so I chose not to do so. Along that 30-yard swatch of pines going south from my corner tree, I placed a motion camera facing out into the open field area. This was the second location I prepared, and while eating a sandwich and walking down the field edge to leave, I saw a doe and her fawns browsing their way down a hillside through one of those gold-colored weed fields that dropped into the property from the north. They were about a half a mile away, and looking at my watch, it was 3:15, and those deer were my signal that it was time to leave the property. I drove up a bordering hillside road and parked for the rest of the evening at a location where I could glass the entire valley below for deer movements. It's common during and after gun season for mature bucks to take on more nocturnal movements, and of the 9 deer I saw, 3 of them were bucks, but they were all 1.5-year-old bucks. That night, while sitting in my motel room, I began formatting a plan, and the only way I could see it, the only smart way of doing this, was to totally eliminate hunting on morning sets. There was no way of accessing the bench in the timber location where the scrapes were for a morning hunt without spooking deer. And since the prepared pine was on an old crop field edge with some alfalfa in it, the likelihood of spooking deer there was also high on a morning entry. So I decided to pass on morning hunts altogether. That decision took me from 10 hunts down to 5 hunts, which would make for some long, boring mornings. But I sure wouldn't have to worry about sleep deprivation, as I could sleep in every morning. For some reason, that inactive scrape area within the timber just kept sucking my mind in, even though at this time of year, with no foliage and where it was, I knew I would spook deer on an evening entry as well. And I knew that it was a mistake to hunt there. Like an idiot, though, on the first evening, that's exactly where I hunted. And other than spooking 2 deer with my entry, I saw nothing but uncoordinated turkeys flying up into their nighttime roosts in all the trees surrounding me. There was definitely a good turkey population on this property. As great a location as that would have been during the early bow season, it was immediately taken out of the mix, leaving only the pine for the next 4 evening hunts, and I absolutely hate having only one option for 4 sits. So I was going to sit there at least 2 times and see how it did and respond accordingly. From where I parked, there was a lane that dumped into a deep ravine that went north and passed along the west end of the pines and continued alongside the west side of the weed field, making it a perfect entry route for an evening hunt. So as not to spook deer with my entries, I would walk the ravine until halfway up the field, cross the field edge fence, and walk across the open field until I got even with the pine on the point. And then I would turn and go directly to it. From the valley the deer bed in south of the pines, they can't see over the crest of the field edge, so my entries would go unnoticed. The first evening at the pine, a snowstorm came in and dropped a few inches, which coated the tops of the pine boughs. There was no doubt that my ScentLok windproof vortex suit in the vertigo pattern would make me not only invisible scent-wise, but also invisible by sight, as it would blend in perfectly with the snow on the branches. The wind was directly out of the north, and had this hunt taken place prior to me learning how to properly use ScentLok in the late 1990s, there was no way I could have hunted this pine without being winded, as the wind and natural evening downward thermals would have blown my human odor right over the hill into the valley south of the pines where the deer were bedded. By the late 1990s, wind direction, thermals, and swirling winds had become irrelevant to me when choosing where and when to hunt, and I've never, ever looked back. That evening I saw a doe and 3 fawns and about a 16-inch inside spread 2.5-year-old 6-point. In order not to spook deer with my exit, I waited until well after dark before getting down and then exited into the valley south of the pines where the deer had been bedded and moved out of. Had I walked into or along the field edge, I would have definitely spooked deer in the field, and by exiting through the valley, I did not. The next evening I was back in the pine, and by the time I strategically placed grabber body warmers on my bottom layer of merino wool, and I placed one over each kidney, and I placed one on my sternum, and I zipped up my jacket for the hunt, it was 3 p.m. A light snow had been falling since around noon. The temperature was in the mid-20s and dropping fast, and the wind was about 12 to 15 miles an hour directly from the north, same as it was the day before. A little stronger. Around 3:30, the snow picked up, and at times it was snowing so hard that it looked like a whiteout in the field. It just added to the beauty of not only this place, but of this cold weather hunting experience. Hunters that don't hunt during light winter storms don't know what they're missing from a sheer beauty perspective. There was a perfectly untouched white blanket of snow on the ground. Every branch of every bush and tree and every pine bough was uniformly coated in white, and looking across the field, my visual pretty much dissipated into a totally white background of snow. It's moments like these where I can lose some of my focus on the hunt while mentally absorbing the beauty of nature. That may sound a little cheesy, but I just love being in nature when it looks like a postcard. While perched 25 feet up the mature white pine in my saddle, I was very relaxed, I was warm, and I was very gratified that I had made this trip. Shortly after 4 o'clock, the same doe and fawns from the previous evening entered the field from the corner to the south of me. They walked out into the field and began feeding while slowly moving to the north. It was snowing pretty heavy by then, and they didn't go 50 yards before they began to fade out of sight. At around 5:30, a big buck came out of the southeast corner of the field where the pines met with the river. He just stood there for a couple minutes scoping out what he could see of the field in the hard falling snow. He began walking west along the edge of the field in my direction and was sniffing the snow as he came. Under a pine that had a scrape beneath it when I was scouting, he stopped and scent-marked an overhanging licking branch and reopened the scrape below it. While he was working the snow-covered pine bough licking branch, it was cool watching the snow on it fall in his face. He continued down the edge of the pines about 10 yards and then veered away from it to cut the corner out. He was now coming basically directly towards the pine that I was in. And my guess was that he was going to come and reopen the scrape that was below it the day before. It had been an hour and a half since the doe and fawns passed, and their tracks were totally covered in the snow by the time he cut them. But he could still smell where they had passed and turned to follow him. At a distance of 14 yards and moving, I drew my 55-pound Matthews Conquest bow, performed a vocal domat to stop him, and he wheeled and stopped and then turned his head towards me. I placed my pin forward on his right shoulder to account for his quartering to me shot angle, and then I released my Maxima Red 250 arrow tipped with a G5 3-blade striker. The arrow seemed to have found its mark, and I watched as he leaped high into the air, landed, and headed back towards the corner of the field where he came from. Within seconds, he disappeared back into the pines. Strangely, immediately after the shot, while watching the buck run to the corner, out of the corner of my eye, I also caught movement of a deer's ass running to the south. As the buck was turning and following the tracks of the doe and fawns, there had to be a doe just to the south of me along the tree line, and she must have walked slightly out into the field just before I took the shot. And she ran south and went through the pines and back over the hill into that valley. Anyway, I knew the shot was good by not only seeing the entry, but also by the buck's reaction from the hit. From the tree, I could still see blood spatters in the snow. I took off my scentlock jacket and both of the undergarments below it down to my merino wool base, and I packed the undergarments into my backpack and then put the jacket back on. While descending the tree, I unscrewed the steps and set them at the base of the tree. I then went over and took down the motion camera and set it by the steps. I then walked out to where the buck was hit and the arrow had passed through and was stuck in the ground, and the only thing sticking up above the snow was the blood-drenched fletching. The snow at the shot site was spotted in red, and even though light was dimming, I could easily make out lots of red dots for quite some distance. A first grader could have easily followed the red blood in the white snow, and about 30 yards into the valley beyond the pines and close to the river, I could see him up ahead all sprawled out. He was in fact the 10-point, and he was absolutely perfect. And when I dressed him, there was a perfect triangular cut punched through the front of his right lung and through the center of his left lung. Before leaving to either get help or get my sled, I took one of my layering garments out of my backpack and laid it over the buck's body to hopefully ward off any coyotes, because I had seen some coyote tracks earlier. The snow in the field was too deep to drive my minivan through, so I called Shannon. Shannon is a sales representative for the agency that I work with, and he lives in Ohio. He resides about an hour and a half away from where I was, but he owned a four-wheel drive truck, and I figured if I paid him for gas, he might come down. The snow on the ground was probably 8 inches deep, and it was still snowing when Shannon arrived at around 8:30, but we were still able to drive right over to the corner of the field and load the buck up. There are times when a truck is nice, and this was definitely one of those times, but overall, I will still take my minivan, which is a mini hotel room, over any other type of vehicle for solo hunting, which is what I do 98% of the time. It was a good thing I got down and trailed him immediately, because when we got there, he was covered in snow, and the previous easy-to-follow blood trail in the snow was now covered over with several more inches of snow. I would have found him anyway, but recovery might have required coming back in the morning to search for a hump under the snow. On our way back to the hotel, I asked Shannon if he would stop at the gas station I'd been getting jerky and pop from. The owner at the station, when I first arrived, had told me that I was an idiot for thinking I could just come down there and take a good buck a couple of days after their gun season ended. And of course, I wanted to show him the buck and mention that he was wrong. Deer hunting is such an egotistical activity, and anytime you can have fun with it and rub it into somebody, it just seems like the thing to do. He was definitely impressed with the buck and was kind of shocked that I had an opportunity that close to gun season. After getting back to the motel and unloading the buck into my sled and then into my minivan, I checked the motion camera card to see what, if any, pictures were on it, and lo and behold, I had an awesome picture of the 10-point literally 1 or 2 seconds before I released my arrow. The doe's ass was also in the same picture. I must have been so concentrating on that buck that I never saw her until after he started running away. There was a good lesson in this kill, in my opinion, and it's the reason I killed this buck, in my opinion. When Mike was hunting along the pines during the early bow season and during gun season, he would walk along the edge of the pines to his tree. And in doing so, because the foliage was down and the deer could see from that valley to the south up through the bottom of those open pines, the deer could actually see him and they would spook. Or else they would just stay bedded, but they wouldn't come out that way until after dark. So by entering through the open field, it allowed me to go unnoticed with my entries. And while that may seem trivial, it was the total difference maker in how the deer moved up into the weed field during daylight hours. It's little things like that that can make a big difference in the outcome of a hunt. Something as minor as how you enter your hunting location. I can't begin to express how gratifying it was to take that nice of a buck after gun season with a bow. It was like spreading icing on top of what was already a very good season. It was my fourth book buck of the season. 2 in Michigan, 1 in Kansas, and 1 in Ohio.